In the heart of a city where concrete and shadows replace mercy, there exists a man known only by fear, a mafia boss who built an empire on control, silence, and the absence of feeling. For decades, he orchestrated violence with the cold precision of someone who had learned to bury his humanity so deep that even he believed it was gone. But death has a way of resurrecting what we thought we'd killed. The death of his wife, the only person who ever saw him as human, left a wound so profound that no amount of power could cauterize it. Every Saturday morning, he visits her grave alone, a ritual performed in solitude where no bodyguard, no rival, no witness can see him break. Here, in the silence of the cemetery, the man who commands armies of men collapses into grief. Here, he is not a boss. He is simply a man mourning the loss of the person who loved him despite everything he was. This is where the story begins, with tears he believes no one will ever see, and with a waitress who appears when the world needs it most. What follows is not a tale of crime or redemption through power. It is a story of how a single act of human kindness can shatter the walls we've spent a lifetime building. It asks a question that haunts every person living in the margins of morality. Is it ever too late to remember what it means to be human? Can grace find us even when we've earned only judgment? Chapter 1. The Grave. That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. The cemetery sits on the eastern edge of the city, where the noise of traffic fades into the distant hum of the expressway, and the only sound that remains is the wind moving through bare branches. Marco De Luca, though few people called him by his first name anymore, stood alone before a marble stone engraved with a name that had belonged to the only person who ever truly knew him, Juliana De Luca, 1962-2024, beloved wife, light in darkness. He knelt in the wet grass, his expensive coat darkening with moisture, his gloved hands trembling as he placed white lilies, her favorite, against the stone. The man who never wept found his shoulders shaking. The man who commanded silence with a glance was now the one silenced by grief so profound it felt like drowning on dry land. 16 months. It had been 16 months since the heart attack took her from him in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. She had been tending her garden. She had been alive at 2:47 p.m. and gone by 2:52 p.m. 5 minutes. That was all it took for the world to hollow out. Marco pressed his forehead against the stone, his breath visible in the cold air. His hands that had ordered unspeakable things, hands that had beaten men until they confessed, hands that had built an empire through fear and silence, were now useless. They could not hold her. They could not rewind time. They could only remember. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the stone, to the woman beneath it, to God if he was listening to the prayers of a man like him. "I'm sorry I wasn't the man you deserved. I'm sorry I chose the life instead of choosing you." He didn't know how long he knelt there. Time had stopped meaning anything since she died. What was an hour, a minute, a day? Without her, all time was the same, an endless grey expanse of moments he had to survive. He had money, he had power, he had men who would die for him. But what he didn't have was her hand in his, her voice telling him that even a man like him deserved forgiveness. The sound of footsteps on gravel made him look up. His instinct kicked in immediately, threat assessment, distance, exits. But his eyes and hands were too wet, his mind too fractious to process danger properly. He turned away, shielding his face, hoping whoever approached would simply pass by and leave him to his breaking. He heard the footsteps slow. Stop. The person did not walk away. Chapter 2. The Apparition. "Excuse me," a woman's voice, soft, hesitant, genuinely uncertain. Are you okay?" Marco froze. In his world, no one asked if he was okay. People asked where his orders came from. People asked for mercy. People asked for their lives. No one asked if he was okay. He didn't turn around. Instead, he slowly rose to his feet, his body moving with the careful deliberation of a man reconstructing himself after breaking. When he finally faced her, she was younger than her voice suggested. Maybe 40, maybe less. It was hard to tell in the grey morning light. She wore a waitress's uniform under a thin jacket, her name tag reading Rosa. She was nothing. She was everything. She was the ordinary world, intruding on his private cathedral of grief. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He had spent the morning alone, and his words felt strange in his mouth. Rosa didn't leave. She stood there, her brown eyes showing something he hadn't seen directed at him in years. Genuine concern, not fear, not calculation, not the careful respect through terror that everyone else showed him. Just concern, the kind a stranger might feel for another human being who appeared broken on a cold morning. "You don't look fine," she said carefully. "I come here sometimes, in the mornings before my shift. I see you come every Saturday." She paused. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to intrude. It's just, I've lost people too, and I know what it looks like when grief is eating someone alive." Marco studied her face. She had no idea who he was. She had no idea that she was standing before a man responsible for deaths, disappearances, and damage that rippled through countless lives. To her, he was simply a man at a grave, broken and alone, a man who deserved kindness. He looked back at the stone, at Juliana's name carved in marble, and something in him shifted, a crack in the armor he'd spent a lifetime forging. "My wife," he said quietly, 16 months ago. "I'm sorry," Rosa said, and she meant it. He could hear it. Chapter 3. The Ordinary Kindness. What happened next was simple, so simple that it seemed impossible such a small gesture could begin to reshape a man's entire soul. Rosa reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a thermos. "I brought coffee," she said. "I always bring too much. Would you like some?" Marco had not accepted kindness from a stranger in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like. He took the thermos with hands that still bore the ghost of trembling, and he drank coffee that tasted like warmth and human decency. They stood in silence before Juliana's grave, Marco, Rosa, and the memory of a woman who had loved a man despite everything he was. "What was her name?" Rosa asked. "Juliana," he said. She was everything." Rosa nodded, and they stood together in silence as the morning light began to soften the shadows. No one had stood with him at this grave since the funeral. His men didn't know he came here. His rivals would have used this moment of vulnerability to strike, but Rosa simply stood beside him, a stranger who understood that sometimes grief needs a witness, and sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the most radical. When Marco finally turned to leave, Rosa pressed something into his hand, a small card with the address of a diner and a note. "Open Saturdays, 5 a.m. You look like you could use a regular place. No questions asked." He looked at her, this ordinary woman who had stumbled into his private devastation and somehow made it feel less like drowning. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it in ways he wasn't sure he could explain. "Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of redemption and courage can travel." Chapter 4. The first morning. The diner smelled like coffee and possibility, a combination Marco hadn't experienced in decades. It sat on 5th Street, a narrow establishment with red vinyl booths and a counter lined with chrome stools. The morning light filtered through windows decorated with handwritten specials. Eggs Benedict, $8.99. Fresh pie, made today. Coffee, endless. Marco had walked past this diner 1,000 times without seeing it. It was the kind of place that existed in the margins of his world, visible but irrelevant, populated by people whose names and faces he would never know. But Rosa worked here, and on the first Saturday after their cemetery encounter, he found himself sitting in a corner booth, watching her move through the space, with a grace that came from years of practice. She wore the same uniform, the same name tag, the same tiredness that comes from standing on your feet for 8 hours. But when she saw him, her face transformed. Not with fear, with genuine happiness. "You came," she said, pouring coffee without asking if he wanted any. "I came," Marco repeated, as if the words themselves were a small victory. What followed over the next weeks was a ritual unlike anything in his life. Every Saturday morning, Marco arrived at 5:30 when the diner was nearly empty. Rosa worked the early shift specifically to be there, though neither of them spoke about this arrangement. He sat in his booth. She brought coffee. They talked. At first, the conversations were about nothing. The weather, the quality of the eggs, the way the morning light hit the parking lot. But gradually, imperceptibly, the conversations deepened. Rosa told him about her daughter, a teenager struggling with addiction. She told him about her ex-husband, who had never learned to be present. She told him about the feeling of being invisible, of moving through the world without leaving a mark. And Marco, for the first time in his adult life, began to tell the truth. Not everything. He didn't tell her about the bodies, about the orders, about the decisions that haunted him with the weight of centuries. But he told her about loneliness. He told her about the cost of power, how it isolates you, how it turns every human connection into a transaction, how you can have everything and still feel completely empty. "I wasn't always this way," he said one morning, staring into his third cup of coffee. "I wanted to be different. Juliana wanted me to be different. But the choice got made for me a long time ago, and by the time I realized what I'd become, it was too late to change." Rosa sat across from him in the booth, something she did only when the diner was empty, breaking the rules about fraternization. "It's never too late," she said. "Not as long as you're still breathing. Not as long as you still remember who you wanted to be." Marco looked at this woman, this ordinary woman who worked at a diner and tended graves on Saturday mornings, and felt something crack open inside him. A door, a window, a possibility. "Why are you being kind to me?" he asked. "Because I can," Rosa answered simply. "Because kindness is the only thing that's kept me alive." Chapter 5. The revelation, the moment of recognition, came on a cold Saturday in February, 4 months after their first encounter in the cemetery. Marco was telling Rosa about a memory. He and Juliana, 30 years ago, dancing in a small club to jazz music, completely unaware of the trajectory their lives would take. He was describing how she had laughed, how her head had fit perfectly against his chest, how for one night he had believed they might have a normal life. Rosa's face went pale, her hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "What?" Marco asked. "What is it?" "My mother," Rosa whispered. She was a maid at the Palazzo Hotel back in the 80s. She used to tell me about a couple she saw dancing one night, said they were the most beautiful thing she'd ever witnessed. She said the man looked dangerous, but the woman made him look safe. She said... Rosa's voice broke. She said she knew they were meant to be together forever. Marco felt the world tilt. "Your mother. What was her name?" "Elena," Rosa said. "Elena Rossi. She died 10 years ago. Cancer." The pieces reassembled. The pieces reformed. The pieces became clear. Elena had been one of the staff at the hotel where he and Juliana had celebrated their engagement. Elena, who had watched them dance. Elena, who had asked Juliana with genuine warmth if she was truly happy with a man like him. Juliana had taken her hand and said, "He's going to change. He's going to be better. I believe in him." Juliana had been wrong. He hadn't changed. He had gone deeper into darkness, but Elena had believed in that possibility. Elena had witnessed something true and had carried it forward to her daughter. "Rosa," Marco said slowly, "your mother, did she ever tell Juliana that she thought my father would hurt us?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, your wife told my mother that she was sorry we'd been hurt. She brought me a toy when I was small, a music box. I still have it." Marco understood then. The universe was not random, grace was not accidental, and kindness, when offered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right person, could shatter the walls of years. Juliana had cared about a stranger's broken child. Now, a stranger's daughter was offering him grace. He wept at the counter of a diner while Rosa held his hand, and the morning light moved across the floor like a blessing. Chapter 6. The Weight of Names. The knowledge of their connection changed everything and nothing. Marco continued to arrive every Saturday morning. Rosa continued to pour coffee and to sit with him during the quiet hours before the diner filled with regular customers. But now there was an added weight to their silence, the weight of Juliana's kindness, reaching forward through time and space to touch them both. Over the following weeks, Marco found himself thinking differently about his life. Not regretfully. He was too old and too damaged for regret, but differently. He began to see the consequences of his choices, not as abstract calculations, but as real people. Families destroyed, children orphaned, women widowed. One Saturday, he asked Rosa about her daughter. "She's in a program now," Rosa said. 3 months clean. She's scared every day, but she's trying." Rosa stirred her coffee. "Your wife paid for my mother's funeral. Did you know that? She didn't know my mother well. They'd only spoken a few times, but Juliana paid for everything. She said it was what love would do." Marco felt his chest constrict. "I didn't know." "She didn't want you to know," Rosa said. "She said it would upset you. She said the kind of man you were becoming wouldn't understand why she'd give money to a stranger. She said she had to protect you from knowing how cruel you were becoming." The words should have wounded him. Instead, they healed something. They meant that Juliana had seen him, truly seen him, and had loved him anyway. She had loved him and had grieved what he was becoming. "I want to help your daughter," Marco said. "Whatever she needs, rehabilitation, education, a job, I want to help." Rosa shook her head. "That's not why I told you this. I'm not looking for payment for kindness received." "I know," Marco said. "But your mother was kind to Juliana. Juliana was kind to your mother, and you were kind to me. I want to continue that chain, not as penance, as continuation." Rosa studied him for a long moment. "Okay," she finally said. "Okay. Her name is Sophia. She wants to be a nurse." If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Marco and Juliana reach more people who still believe in compassion. Chapter 7. The Shadow of Reckoning. The peace of those Saturday mornings could not last forever in a world like Marco's. His rivals, men who had been waiting for weakness, for distraction, for vulnerability, began to move against him. It started with territory encroachment, then escalated to threats against his operations. The message was clear: the old lion was losing his bite. Marco's captains came to him with recommendations: eliminate the threat, reassert control, return to the old ways. Instead, Marco surprised them. Instead, he negotiated. Instead, he retreated from territories that didn't matter. Instead, he began the process of stepping back from power, something that had seemed impossible before Rosa. His men were confused. The underworld was astonished. The expected bloodbath never came. One of his oldest associates, a man named Vittorio, who had been with him for 40 years, confronted him in his study one evening. "You're letting them take what's yours," Vittorio said. "The man I knew would have buried them." "The man you knew was already buried," Marco replied. "He just didn't know it yet." Vittorio looked at him with something like sorrow. "What changed?" "A waitress served me coffee," Marco said, "and told me a story about kindness reaching across time. And I realized I'd spent my entire life building something that meant nothing." Vittorio left that night. So did several others. Marco's organization began to fracture, to decentralize, to transform into something that looked less like an empire and more like a network of independent operations, loosely connected by old loyalties. The business side of him understood the losses. The human side of him, the part Rosa had awakened, understood that some losses were actually gains. Chapter 8. The Letter. 3 years after their first encounter in the cemetery, Marco sat in a hospital room and watched Rosa's daughter Sofia receive her nursing degree diploma, framed and displayed on her bedside table. Sofia had overdosed 6 months earlier and had barely survived. The irony was not lost on Marco. He had saved her life with resources, but Rosa had saved her soul with love. The irony was also not lost on Rosa, who watched him watch her daughter and understood exactly what was happening. That evening, Marco went home to the apartment where he'd lived with Giuliana. He'd kept it exactly as she'd left it. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, her photograph on the dresser, the scent of her perfume still faintly present in the closet. He sat at her desk and wrote a letter, not to Rosa, to Giuliana. "My love, I don't know if you can see me from wherever you are, but I need to say these things. I need you to know that I finally understood what you were trying to teach me all those years. I finally understood that power without compassion is just destruction, that control without connection is just isolation. I've been a different man these past 3 years, not a good man. I'm not naive enough to believe I could undo the harm I've caused, but a man who is trying, a man who is remembering how to be human. Your kindness reached forward in time and touched a stranger's daughter. That kindness then reached back and touched me. That's the only redemption I'll ever have, and it's more than I deserve. Wait for me. I'm coming home soon. Forever yours, Marco." He placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and set it on the pillow beside her photograph. Then he sat in the silence of the apartment they'd shared and allowed himself to finally rest. Chapter 9. The Dawn. The final Saturday came on a morning in March, spring just beginning to break through winter's grip. Marco arrived at the diner at 5:30, as he had for 3 years. Rosa was waiting, as she always was, but today was different. Today, she had cleared the diner. The closed sign hung on the door, though it was still their regular time. "I wanted privacy," Rosa said simply, "for this." She had prepared a small altar, not religious but reverent, with photographs. Giuliana, Elena, Marco and Giuliana dancing, Elena with Rosa as a child, Sofia in her nursing uniform. "Generations," Rosa said, "connected by kindness, by one person choosing to see another person's humanity." They stood together before the altar, Marco and Rosa, an unlikely pair bound by threads of grace that had woven themselves through decades and across deaths. "I'm going to follow her," Marco said quietly. "Not soon, but eventually. I'm at peace with that now." Rosa nodded. "You did it, you know. You changed. Maybe not all the way, maybe not enough to undo everything, but you changed." "She changed me," Marco said, looking at Giuliana's photograph. "She believed I could be different, and that belief was strong enough to reach forward through time and find me again in the form of you." Rosa took his hand. "The bell rings for the morning shift in 10 minutes, she said. "I need to open the diner, but I want you to know. I want you to know that you gave my daughter her life back. You gave my family something we'd lost." "No," Marco said. "Your mother gave it to me first. All those years ago, Juliana carried it forward. You completed the circle. The morning light was breaking through the windows, transforming the diner from a place of shadows into a place of light. Marco looked at the ordinary beauty of it, the red booths, the chrome counter, the small altar of kindness. He understood now why Juliana had loved him. It wasn't because he was powerful or feared. It was because she had seen even then that beneath everything he was capable of this, of sitting in the presence of grace and finally accepting it. When Marco left the diner that morning, he walked toward the cemetery rather than away from it. He needed to tell Juliana that he'd finally come home to himself. The grave was waiting. The white lilies were waiting. And somewhere in the space between earth and sky, he felt her presence, not in grief anymore, but in peace. Epilogue. 16 years later, a nurse named Sophia stands before a grave, placing white lilies against cold stone. The name reads Marco De Luca, 1956-2040. He learned to love. Her mother, Rosa, now retired from the diner, stands beside her, holding her granddaughter's hand. The child is 4 years old and asks questions about the man in the grave, questions that Rosa answers with the truth, that he was a man who had been lost and then found, that he was broken and then healed, that he learned that the only redemption that matters is the redemption that reaches toward others. The diner still stands on 5th Street, still named Rosa's, still famous for its endless coffee and the stories people tell about a man and woman who met there, who understood each other without judgment, who believed that kindness could remake the world one Saturday morning at a time. And every morning, as the light breaks across the city, someone walks through those doors seeking refuge. Rosa, or one of Sophia's sisters who now runs the place, pours them coffee and asks if they're okay. And when they say they're not, they're offered what Juliana taught, what Marco learned, what Rosa embodied. The simple, radical belief that every human being deserves to be seen, that every broken soul deserves a chance at grace, that redemption, when offered with genuine compassion, can dismantle empires built on fear and replace them with something infinitely stronger, connection. The bell above the door chimes. Another soul enters. Another story begins. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of Marco and Juliana. See you in the next one.